Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. This is now the third in our series where I talk to a particularly interesting friends of mine who are doing important work and thought-provoking work all over the world. We've been up to Haifa for a bit of systematic philosophy. We went to Tokyo to chat to the rabbi of the Japanese Jewish community, and this evening it's Dr. Toby Greene. So good evening or good afternoon, Toby.
Hi there. Good evening to you. It's just turned midday here, so I guess it's good afternoon here.
Very civilized. I always start by just describing how I know the person I'm having the conversation with. So I'll give a bit of background, and then I just hand over to Toby. First of all, to introduce himself and about his biography, which I think is one of the most interesting parts, and then take us on a tour of contemporary Zionism and the political situation in the state of Israel, and there'll be time hopefully for questions at the end. So oddly enough, I knew Toby sort of before I knew him, because I think that, I'm sure in fact, that your mother taught me at infant school. She was one of my earliest teachers. I often say that Mrs. Greene taught me how to read, which may or may not be true, but she certainly has a lot to answer for. And then we were at the same school and the same university. And I was reminded today that also we worked in Parliament for two different MPs at the same time. So sort of a lot in common in terms of education and early work. And I think both we are fair to say, I think both on the left, both politically and in terms of Zionism. And I thought it was very interesting and important to hear a left Zionist perspective, because we often hear a lot from the right, not least because we've been in power for an awfully long time. And a lot of the Hasbara coming out from Israel has been on it with a right-wing perspective, but there is still a left of Zionism, and it's important and interesting to hear it. So with that introduction, with great thanks to Toby for joining us, maybe just tell us something about your trajectory, how you ended up interested in Zionism, being in Israel, your academic work, your political work, and then we'll move into more of the political ideological discussion.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for having me. It's a really and it's very nice to see you all. Greetings to you all in Sydney. I'm going to speak to my mum after this conversation, and I'll repeat to her what you said. Whether or not it's true, I'm going to assume that it is, and she'll be extremely proud that, from your perspective at least, that's still the narrative. Yeah, happy to talk a little bit about my background. As you said, Ben, you and I have some sort of similar life paths up to a certain point. I grew up in Manchester, in the Jewish community in Manchester. Like Ben, attended a Jewish primary school and then a non-Jewish secondary school. And I took a gap year in Israel before I went to Cambridge, where I studied philosophy and theology. And then I spent a year working as a movement worker for a Zionist youth movement, FZY, the Federation of Zionist Youth, which is a British Jewish Zionist youth movement, before I ended up pitching myself at Westminster and working for a Labour MP, and when I got to the House of Commons, found Ben there, which was among the friendly faces and familiar faces that I found working in Parliament when I got there, which was a very great pleasure. And an honour really to work in Parliament at that time. After I'd worked for a Labour MP for a bit, I went to work for a pro-Israel caucus within the British Labour Party called Labour Friends of Israel. And at that time, the leader of the Labour Party was Tony Blair, and it was rather easier at that time to be a Labour friend of Israel than it has been subsequently. And then in around 2006, I with my then fiance, now my wife, we made a decision together to move to Israel, initially for a year, and then that year, after that year, we made Aliyah, and now it's sort of 15 maybe even nearly 16 years later, and we're still here, and we've been here for most of that time, except for 1 year when we were back in London a couple of years ago. When I got to Israel, my first job in Israel was working for a team of international political consultants. So we were doing focus groups and surveys and running political campaigns for all kinds of politicians in various European countries, which is very interesting and intense. But I moved on quite quickly to work for a British organization called BICOM, which is a kind of British research organization and think tank which promotes UK-Israel relations. And my job was basically explaining and interpreting Israeli politics for British journalists, British policy researchers, British officials, and politicians also. In the meantime, I started working on a PhD, which I published. I completed in 2011 and published in 2013. It was on British policy in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, and in particular during the Blair government. And I analyzed the differences between Blair and much of his party and how they perceived Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, especially in the context of the war on terror and after 9/11 and the rising challenges of radical Islam and that kind of thing. And then around 2015, I made a decision to take the leap into academia full-time. And I did postdocs at Tel Aviv University and then at Hebrew University, where I also taught courses. And then I got a fellowship to go back to London for a year or so at Queen Mary University. And I do research on foreign policy decision-making. I've worked a lot in the last few years, particularly on Europe and European foreign policy, which I also teach as a subject. And when I was in London, I actually focused on the foreign policy worldviews of rising radical right parties in Britain, France, and Germany. We're about to have a general election in France, for example, where Marine Le Pen is projected to reach the second round, the leader of the radical right Rassemblement National party, what was once Front National, led by her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. So I've been researching the foreign policy worldviews of politicians like Marine Le Pen and others in Europe. But I write and publish on European foreign policy, also on Israel and the Middle East as well. And yeah, so I guess that sort of brings us up to date, Ben.
Very good. I wanted to add that your articles in the British press and the British Jewish press, whenever they popped up, I always found them so thoughtful and insightful and interesting, and it was a real pleasure to hear your voice through the page, even when I was in America and you were in Israel, and we weren't in contact a very great deal. Maybe let's just start by looking at what's happening in Israel right now. It looks like the government might collapse. That's a development of the last few days. Maybe just give us an analysis of what's happening and why it's happened and what the future's going to look like.
Right. Well, I mean, when we first talked about doing this discussion, Ben, and you said you'd like to talk about the state of Israeli politics, and it's a topic that I used to get to talk about a lot to people outside of Israel, and I do it less these days. So I kind of started with a blank piece of paper, and I started to think, how could I kind of encapsulate what's going on, all the different complexities and issues, and then it just so happens that the very day that we're speaking is a dramatic political moment in Israel. And I think if I talk a little bit about what's happened, it'll be a way to kind of broaden out a bit, to talk a bit more big picture about some of the general themes in Israeli politics and the divides, what I call the contestation, the deep divisions within Israeli society, which lie behind what's happened in the last couple of days. So you may know we have currently in Israel a very broad a coalition of parties that covers the full spectrum of Israeli society, left, center, and right, and even for the first time in Israel's history, an Arab party. So it's a very extraordinary coalition. It's existed for 10 or 11 months. Many people couldn't believe that it would ever be formed, much less that it would last as long as it has. It was formed because of a very unusual situation. We had a crisis in Israeli politics. We had 4 elections in 2 years. We've never had a situation in Israel before where governments could not be formed after the election. It was unique to the last couple of years, and it's created by a unique problem, which is the fact that the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is on trial on 3 counts of corruption. And usually when you have a very divided parliament, a very divided Knesset, you can cobble together a coalition, even if it brings together people that have different ideologies, and it usually will last for 2 or 3 years. But in the current circumstances, Netanyahu was not able to draw together enough support because not enough parties or members of the Knesset were willing to serve in a government led by a prime minister on trial. So that led to this very, very unusual coalition that was formed basically with no common ideology, purely a common interest to extricate Israel from this crisis, create a stable government, and that didn't include Netanyahu. It was always a very narrow coalition, a coalition of 61, a majority of 61 out of the 120-seat Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And one of the 61 announced yesterday that she was quitting. Her name is Idit Silman. And she's from the very right-wing Yamina party of the current Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. And she's really been under pressure for most of the last years, her and her colleagues, since they joined the coalition, being accused by their political base of being essentially a fig leaf for what is a sort of center-left Israeli government that the right in Israel says is causing grievous harm to the state. The trigger issue, the sort of straw that broke the camel's back, around which Idit Silman sort of has justified her final decision to quit this coalition, is an extraordinary one, but one I think that quite sort of symbolizes some of the divides in Israeli society today. So earlier this week, the health minister, who is from a left-wing party called Meretz, he sent a tweet in which he reminded people that that guards in Israeli hospitals will not be checking the bags of people that enter the hospitals for chametz during Pesach. Okay. It used to be the case that during Pesach, if you entered an Israeli hospital, certainly many parts of the country, it may well be that the guards would check your bag just in case you were smuggling in a sandwich or a piece of pita bread or something like that, which would be considered unacceptable, obviously, on Pesach. But a couple of years ago, a Supreme Court ruling declared that this was illegal, and that if somebody wishes to have a chametz in their bag, a sandwich or a biscuit or whatever it might be that's not kosher for Pesach, they're entitled to do that. The state cannot enforce people, and a hospital guard cannot search your bag in case you're carrying chametz. People have the rights to eat what they want and carry what they want inside their bag. So even a year ago, this decision is not newly enforced. It came into force a year ago that guards checking people's bags going into hospitals will not be searching bags for chametz. So all the health minister did was simply remind people of that fact. But for Idit Silman and her supporters, this is a symbol of the state not protecting the culture or religious or social values of the Jewish majority. And that is a sort of symbol of all that's wrong with the values of the center left, which and their presence in the current coalition. And that has been seen as the kind of trigger issue for her to leave the government. Now, if that seems incredibly trivial and an absurd reason why a government might lose its majority and be at risk of collapse, then personally, I would agree, but it's symbolic of something much bigger. It's symbolic of a deep divide within Israeli society that maps onto lots of different levels of challenges. So it's a divide about what kind of society we should have inside in Israel. And that divide also maps onto how to handle the Palestinian issue. It also maps onto how Israel should position itself in global affairs. And also, I think it maps onto how Israel should relate to diaspora Jewry. And there's deep divides in Israel on all those issues. I would say there's only one region or one basket of issues where you don't have that divide, and that relates to the region or the Middle East, and I can explain that. But we see this divide across all these baskets. And I'll sort of pause for a minute, Ben, because I could sort of go into each of those issues, or you might want me to focus on one in particular. But I can kind of expand on all of those if you like.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think a tour of the major issues would be very helpful.
Okay, so if we think about that kind of cleavage, that divide in Israeli society, if we look at it in the context of internal Israeli politics, I think the real defining question is, what kind of society are we? Israeli law defined Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. The question is, to what extent should the state emphasize its Jewishness, and to what extent should it emphasize its democratic character? For the right, the Jewish character of the state should be paramount. The state should act in the interests of the nation defined by ethno-cultural characteristics, defined by the characteristics of Jewishness. And that should be the paramount value. For the left or the center left, Israel should be Jewish, but only up to the point that democracy allows. The liberal democratic framework should define the extent to which the state is Jewish. So it's what extent, and you see how this example of the guards checking if your bag contains chametz when you go into a hospital, how it symbolizes this wider question of to what extent the state should reinforce and the Jewish character, and to what extent it should be a liberal democratic state that allows for, that reflects and represents and respects the values of its very diverse society, including its non-Jewish minorities. If we map that same divider to the Palestinian question, for the right, if we think about Judea Shomron, Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, or the occupied Palestinian territories, however you want to refer to them, for the right, that land is either religiously, culturally, or nationally property of the Jewish people, and also holding on to that land is essential for Jewish security. Whereas for the center left, the occupation continuing to rule over 2-3 million Palestinians in the West Bank that don't have political rights in the state of Israel, don't get to vote for which government essentially controls their lives in the state of Israel, essentially lacking essential political rights, but continue to be within the de facto borders of the state of Israel. That undermines the liberal democratic character of the state and also the Jewish character of the state, in the sense that the territory under Israel's control it's questionable whether it has a Jewish majority. And of course, we take into account the Gaza Strip as well. It's a complicated story, but for the center left, ending that situation where we have millions of Palestinians under our state's control, but without political rights, is imperative to preserve Israel's character as both Jewish, but also democratic. I'll skip over the regional issue for a second and go to the global picture, because this divide between an emphasis on the rights of the nation and defined in ethnic or cultural terms versus values of liberal democracy, we see it on a global level. It's not just something that's happening in Israel. We see this kind of divide in many countries. I mentioned the French election that's coming up. We've just had an election in Hungary where Viktor Orban, sort of very conservative nationalist figure, has been elected. We've seen it in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. It's one of the factors that explains Britain's decision to leave the European Union. This divide between a perception of the state as having a responsibility to preserve its sovereignty and to protect the interests of the nation defined in ethnic or cultural terms, versus the vision that was really more dominant in the 90s and the period after the Cold War of a world of liberal democratic states, the spread of liberal democracy, and also the spread of international cooperation in terms of a liberal international order, a set of overarching rules or institutions that would govern how states interact with one another, and even create, in the case of the European Union in particular, a set of institutions which governments would choose, national governments would choose to hand over some of their sovereignty to international or even supranational institutions where they would share power together and create systems that would work to promote common values, but also interests above the national level. So in the European Union, for example, you have systems of open borders, you have shared sovereignty on issues of trade and aspects of economic policy, for example. So what we have in many parts of the world is a pushback, a resistance against this. Climate change is another example. So we had this climate change summit probably followed over the last few months, where there's an attempt to try and create international agreements that will limit the sovereignty of states, in a sense, that will tell states this is how much carbon you can burn. And I know that's an issue in Australia as well, for example, where the current government, if I'm not wrong, is rather resistant to these kinds of impositions on the sovereignty of the state. So there is that divide in Israel that I mentioned between the kind of center-left emphasis on liberal democratic values and the right emphasis on the Jewish character of the state. well, you see it also reflected in global issues. So if you think about the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, there's a difference in emphasis between the Prime Minister Bennett, who comes from the right, who has not condemned Vladimir Putin and Russia, has looked to play a more sort of mediating role between Ukraine and Russia, and the Foreign Minister Yair Lapid from a centrist party, who has been much more overt in his condemnation of Putin and sought to align Israel much more closely with, let's say, the Western liberal democratic mainstream, Western states, the US and the Biden and the states of the European Union. And so you see, and it reflects an aspect of this divide between, are we a state that aligns strongly with internationalism, with international liberal institutions and values, or are we a state which looks narrowly at our own national interests? And of course, Israel does have some very sensitive interests with respect to its relations with Russia, particularly regarding the presence of the Russian military and air force in Syria. So you see this difference of emphasis there as well. We saw how close Netanyahu was to Trump, how comfortable he was aligning with Trump and other, let's say, populist nationalist leaders in Europe, including Viktor Orban, that just got re-elected in Hungary, and others. And the current foreign minister, Lapid, is much more comfortable with liberals like Macron in France, like Trump, like Biden in the United States, and those kinds of leaders. And I think this same divide also maps onto Israel's relations with diaspora Jews on two levels. Should the state of Israel, if there is a tension between the interests of the state and the interests of diaspora Jews, and that happens sometimes, should the state think first and foremost about the interests of the state, or should it think about the interests of the Jewish people as a whole? I think the right in Israel thinks first and foremost about the interests of the state, and the center-left is thinking more broadly about the interests of diaspora Jews also. And also in terms of values, we see, I think, among diaspora Jews, some of those same tensions between, is Jewishness about preserving our particular characteristics, about the particular values and history and identity of Jews, and preserving our own welfare in a hostile world, essentially a world where there's always the danger of anti-Semitism? Or is Jewishness about universal values? Are we as Jews aligned with that liberal democratic mainstream in the West that I spoke about, that was so dominant in the 90s and early 2000s, but which is more challenged now? What does our Jewishness represent? Is it about a particular, the welfare of our particular group, our particular ethnicity, our particular nationality and faith? Or is it about being aligned with a wider set of liberal values? And I think that the rightward dominance in Israel that you mentioned, Ben, has been very uncomfortable for many diaspora Jews that align more with progressive, especially those that align with progressive streams of Judaism, which are dominant, of course, in the United States in particular, to see Israel more aligned with that kind of narrower ethnic national values as opposed to those wider universal values mapped onto all those arenas that I mentioned, has created great discomfort for many Jews in the diaspora. And then there's that one basket of issues that I jumped over, which is the region, the Middle East. And that's one area where I think you don't have such a contestation. It's one arena where there is more of a consensus, both about the threats Israel faces, especially the threat posed by Iran and its regional proxies, Iran, which is seeking to acquire nuclear weapons capability, and which is also proliferating weapons, advanced weapons to its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad on our borders, including precision-guided missiles and drones. And that is one of the things that's catalyzed a new alliance and new peace agreements between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, normalization agreements, also known as the Abraham Accords, with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, all of whose foreign ministers visited Israel just a couple of weeks ago for a summit which was barely imaginable in the recent past, because they share the same fears about Iran as we do, but also some fears about America and its declining commitment to our part of the world, which is linked, of course, to its increasing concern with what's happening in your part of the world. This is what Obama called the pivot to Asia, And we see that with examples like the AUKUS strategic agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So as the US becomes more interested in the threat from China and what's happening in the Pacific, it's somewhat less interested in what's happening in Europe and the Middle East, less so in the last couple of months in Europe, of course, because of what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. But that's a concern for Israel also, and those Arab states that have now developed diplomatic relations with Israel because they're concerned about that lack of American commitment to our collective security. So in short, a deep contestation on many levels in Israeli society, and that's going to continue, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Can I just ask maybe three follow-up questions, not necessarily perfectly related, but each I think hope interesting. One is, apart from destabilizing the government by sending out inflammatory tweets, what is the role or the power or the future of the left in Israel? You and I came of age politically, became conscious politically in the 1990s, where the left was in a totally different position in Israel than it is today. I mean, that was its high watermark, essentially, and it's been downhill ever since. So first, maybe a few words about what for the left now and in the future. Second, something which I think has interested modern Orthodox religious Zionists in the diaspora is does Bennett's type of dati identity, lifestyle, practice, symbols, the fact that he wears a kippah, the fact that he's rather restrictive on traveling on Shabbat, how's that going to affect the tensions between the religious and the non-religious populations, and also within the religious populations? And third, we see with all the culture wars going on around the world that we're very conscious of, Israel is very, very deep in the naughty corner. It symbolizes everything that has taken a very high place on sort of hate lists: colonialism, imperialism. Every time a statue is pulled down, there seems to be a dotted line to Israel. So what is a left-wing Zionist response to that sort of contemporary turbocharged delegitimization of the entire Zionist project? So I'm sorry they're quite disparate questions, but maybe you can have a look at them.
Yeah, good questions as well. So the first question was about, I guess, sort of where is the left today? And you're right in terms of the decline of the left. Maybe I'll answer that question with a slightly more personal perspective. If I can describe it to you like this, I moved to Israel with my wife in 2006. We'd been here the summer before that in 2005. For those of you that remember, 2005, the summer of 2005 was the summer of disengagement. It was the summer that Israel forcefully removed all of its settlements from the Gaza Strip, and even 4 small settlements from the northern West Bank under the leadership of Ariel Sharon back then, if you remember. And I remember being in Israel that summer before we'd moved to Israel. And the atmosphere in Israel, it was extremely divided. It was very tense, but it happened. It was implemented successfully under Sharon's leadership. In the intervening year, when we made our decision, we're going to come to Israel, I anticipated a couple of things. Firstly, I anticipated that the tension between Israel and Iran and its proxies would continue to grow, and I was not naive about that. But I also anticipated that we'd sort of turned a corner on the occupation, that the Gaza Strip was the first step. There was a prime minister after Sharon, Ehud Olmert, that had said in the elections in early 2006, essentially, I'm going to continue this process. He didn't say exactly how, but it seemed quite clear that that was the direction of travel, that Israel would continue to withdraw from isolated settlements in the West Bank and consolidate its presence in the West Bank in the major settlement blocks. So it was a gradual process towards separating from the Palestinians, consistent with moving towards a kind of 2-state reality, even though peace negotiations to agree a two-state solution had failed, and then there'd been the Second Intifada, that the Israeli mainstream had recognized we can't continue to rule over millions and millions of Palestinians and remain a Jewish and a democratic state. And it's not good either for our security. We should separate from the Palestinians. And I thought when I came to Israel that that was the direction of travel. If you remember, July 2006 was also a significant time in Israel, not just because it's the time when I arrived, but on the 12th of July 2006, around a week or so after we arrived in Israel, the Second Lebanon War broke out. And that was a turning point, just days after we'd arrived here. Israel was attacked with a cross-border raid from Lebanon by Hezbollah forces coming from Lebanon. They ambushed an Israeli patrol, killed several soldiers. They captured 3 soldiers. We didn't know if they were alive or dead at the time. It turns out that they had died, but their bodies were taken into Lebanon. And Israel launched a major military operation to try and recover the bodies and to try and degrade Hezbollah's activities. It was not a very successful military operation. Many thousands of rockets were fired by Hezbollah at northern towns in Israel. And it came just a few weeks after the abduction of Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border, and a similar military operation by Israel to try and recover Gilad Shalit, which was also unsuccessful. So on 2 fronts where Israel had withdrawn or ended its occupation, essentially in the Gaza Strip and in South Lebanon, Israel had ended its occupation of South Lebanon a few years earlier in 2000. From both of these territories, Israel had been attacked and with costly results. And the conclusion that the Israeli public as a whole, generalizing, drew from these events was Israel evacuating territory, Israel withdrawing from territory, even unilaterally, does not bring peace and security. And that equation became very hard to sustain. And so for people on the left or on the center left, I define myself as center left, it became very difficult to make the case for territorial compromise, for territorial withdrawal, whether through a peace agreement or even unilaterally, after these events, after Israel had been attacked from territories from which it had withdrawn, the Gaza Strip and South Lebanon. And it became very, very difficult for the left to sustain a case for compromise on that front. I think there are many reasons, I think, for the left's decline, but and the failure of the Oslo process was one, but these events really reinforced the difficulties for the left. And I don't think that Israel has really quite got over those experiences. The perception is still very strongly in Israel that whilst it may not be very nice to control the population of Palestinians, we don't really have very good ways to securely end that situation. If you do surveys of the Israeli public, you find a majority of Israeli Jews accept the principle of a two-state solution. They consider a Jewish majority to be more important than controlling all of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, which includes Judea v'Shamron or the West Bank. And yet, they do not see how it is possible to move towards a two-state solution. They do not see how that can be done. So that issue, the Palestinian issue, is which was central to the left's agenda in the 90s, as you rightly said, Ben, when we were becoming kind of politically aware, has ceased to be a credible issue for the left. So where is the left today? I have to accept, as a member of the Israeli Labour Party, and I worked somewhat in the Israeli Labour Party. I worked for the current president of Israel when he was leader of the opposition, Bougie Herzog. I have to accept that the Labour Party, which I belong to, is now a kind of niche party. The number of people that identify as left is a small proportion of the Israeli public, certainly the Israeli Jewish public. And we are part of a wider camp, which is what I would call the center left, which is a coalition of left and center parties, pragmatic parties in the center. And as a part of that camp, our role is to try to fight to defend our values, the values that I spoke about earlier, the liberal and democratic character of the state of Israel alongside its Jewish character, in all the different arenas that I mentioned. The hope that we might leap at any time in the foreseeable future to a conflict-ending agreement with the Palestinians is not realistic, not only because of Israeli politics, also because the state of Palestinian and regional politics. But I think that what I suppose those of us on the center-left hope for is to hold the line, to prevent the Israeli right from taking steps that would make it impossible in the future to separate from the Palestinians or reach something like a two-state outcome, and to try and make the case for moving in the direction of gradually of bringing about a political reality that's closer to a two-state outcome, and gradually reducing the occupation or the signs or the elements of the occupation in the West Bank. The Gaza Strip's another story, a more complicated one, over time. And that's sort of where we are at the moment. And it's what might bring more dramatic changes are very charismatic leadership, very popular leadership, which we don't exactly have at the moment. Greater external pressure potentially, but I don't anticipate that also, despite what you said about Israel kind of being in the naughty corner for many parts of certainly Western liberal societies, or something worse, like a dramatic outbreak of violence, which might change Israeli calculus either. But in the meantime, it's more about trying to stop things getting worse, unfortunately, and making the case for moving in a certain kind of direction.
Thank you. And the Bennett and the religious secular divide.
Okay, yeah. So Bennett's an interesting character because he is the son of American Reform Jews that moved to Israel in the 60s. So he doesn't come from an Orthodox religious background. Wearing the kippah, I think, was a decision, if I'm not wrong, that he took in his adult life. But it was part of a symbol of his politics when he looked to become a leader in the Israeli right, that he also adopted the religious aspects of that lifestyle. And you were suggesting that there might be divisive elements to that, but maybe just clarify slightly your question.
Well, I suppose I'm prompted by, there's a lot of hating on Bennett from parts of the religious community, that from some quarters people say he's worse than out-and-out secular Jews, he's worse than left-wing Jews. They prefer the non-religious Netanyahu to the religious Bennett, even though they themselves call themselves religious Zionists.
So that's, I see what you, because, okay. So for example, given, and it explains it a little bit if we now we know something about Bennett's personal background. His background is not in Orthodox, his family background is not Orthodox Judaism, that he's been rather progressive on issues like the Western Wall, for example, and creating pluralistic prayer spaces or prayer spaces where men and women can worship together, that's comfortable for progressive Jews at the Western Wall, at the Kotel. And on other examples, he has promoted a more open and more pluralistic style of Orthodox Judaism, let's say, in Israel. And I think when you put that in combination with his decision to join the current coalition, for which he was rewarded with the role of prime minister, he is regarded as those suspicions about Bennett with regards to his religiosity are kind of utilized perhaps or deployed against him as part of a wider narrative that says that Bennett and his faction are traitors for joining this pluralistic coalition. And this is part of the narrative of the right, which is, I think, part of the very poisonous aspect of the divisions in Israeli politics and society today, that anybody that is perceived to be less than sufficiently loyal or committed to the Jewishness of the Jewish state, however right-wing they may be, or even seems to coalesce, or in this case forms a coalition with Arab and center and left parties, are branded as traitors. And that explains, that's the kind of pressure that Idit Silman has come under from the right-wing activists over the last year, her and her husband and her children being branded and abused in the streets as traitors. And that's part of what accounts for her decision eventually to kind of crack or fold to that pressure on her personally.
Thank you. And finally, the question of how is the left trying to respond? How can it respond to this very aggressive delegitimization of the states? And it's the entire Zionist enterprise, really.
Yes. So my short answer, and it kind of echoes that famous line from David Ben-Gurion, in 1939, where he said that we have to fight the white paper, the British white paper that stopped Jewish immigration to Palestine. We need to fight the white paper as if there's no Nazis, and we have to fight the Nazis as if there's no white paper. Britain support. So in that time, the Jewish community of Palestine supported the British war effort, but also continued to campaign against the British white paper. For me, as a left-wing Zionist, we have to sometimes think we have to fight delegitimization and anti-Zionism as if there's no occupation, and fight the occupation as if there's no anti-Zionism or delegitimization of Israel. And it's an extremely difficult position to be in, I think. For me, the right position is that the occupation is a threat, mortal threat to Zionism. If we don't have a state with a Jewish majority, if we perpetually attempt to rule over millions of Palestinians that don't want to be ruled over, then we cannot sustain Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. And so we must work proactively to end Israel's control over Palestinians in the West Bank. Even though we can't leap to a final status agreement anytime soon, there's things that we can do to preserve the hope for a two-state solution and gradually reduce the scope of the occupation in the West Bank in line with the hope of a future two-state solution. And from my view, it's imperative that Israel does that. But we must at the same time fight against the anti-Zionism that's a rising tide. And tragically, not only among non-Jewish liberals, but also, and others that are allied to them, political Islamists and others, but also even among some Jewish communities, particularly progressive Jewish communities, on a fringe margin, but nonetheless it's there. And we need to continue to make as forcefully and as clearly as we can the defense, the case for and defend the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination, even whilst we campaign to bring about an end to the occupation, which to my mind threatens the entire Zionist project.
One thing that's been very upsetting, I think to me personally very upsetting, is groups like Jewish Voice for Labour. So in the darkest days of Corbynite cozying up to political Islamists, a radically anti-Israel perspective, a tolerance of anti-Semites, a group of people came to the fore, suddenly found microphones put in front of them all the time, Jewish people or people who suddenly discovered they were Jewish, to support, justify, and decry anybody who opposed or objected to what Corbyn was saying or doing as illegitimate, as instruments of the state of Israel. Now they've receded, as Corbyn is now out of office as leader of the Labour Party, they've receded, but it was a very traumatic moment to see Jews being interviewed on the BBC and ITN and so on, and speaking as Jews, and in the most viscerally bitter terms against the mainstream of the Jewish community, whether left or centre or right. We were all we Zionists bundled together and condemned. It was actually particularly upsetting for me because the chair was no less than the great granddaughter of the translator of the Routledge Mahzor, who we all use. So she came from a deeply, important committed Anglo-Jewish family, and suddenly she was condemning almost all Jews who identify as Jews in Britain. Now, they, as I said, they've receded, but what is a more sophisticated way to push back against them than perhaps we saw when we were taken by surprise by their sudden rise under Corbyn?
I agree with you, and I had the same feeling just this morning. I was reading in the news about a progressive Jewish community in Chicago that has changed its official position from non-Zionism to anti-Zionism. So non-Zionist wasn't enough for them, but this particular, again, I think quite marginal, even in the context of that city, but nonetheless, a Jewish community that is so hostile to Israel, it wishes to publicly display its not only neutrality, but it's anti-Zionism. My own perspective is that a Jew that, okay, I can perhaps understand a non-Zionist position, but an overtly anti-Zionist position for a self-identifying Jew, this perspective either displays a total lack of self-respect or a total lack of understanding of Jewish history. And that's, I think, a perspective. But I think that perspective, or our perspective, Ben, in that sense, is still shared by the vast majority, both of British Jews and of diaspora Jews in general. And I think that those Jewish voices for Labour were quite small, even at the beginning of the Corbyn leadership, and became even smaller as it went along, and as the evidence of how the Labour Party had become institutionally anti-Semitic under Corbyn's leadership became clearer and clearer. And I know many very, very Jews with deep ambivalence about Israel that nonetheless totally got it on Corbyn. They were very critical of Israel, but still recognized or perceived Corbyn and those around him to be anti-Semitic. So I suppose we can take heart to some extent that this is still, at least in the Jewish community, rather marginal trend. And also that in the UK case, the perception, which was quite wide by the end of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, that Corbyn was anti-Semitic, that perception had taken hold quite widely in British society as a whole, and to Corbyn's detriment. I don't think it's why Corbyn did so badly in the last general election, but I think it didn't help. I mean, it probably contributed to the general perception that this guy was not suitable for the role of high office. So we can take some heart again in that perception was harmful, and the Labour Party, in reaction against it, now has a leader whose wife is Jewish, who's working very, very hard to bury everything of the Corbyn legacy. What to do about anti-Zionist diaspora Jews? Honestly, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, except that hope that they remain marginal and try to communicate to non-Jews that may be misled or confused about this issue that commitment to Israel, even though there may be deep ambivalence about the recent Israeli governments, even among diaspora Jews, even though there may be many diaspora Jews that are much to the left of where Israeli politics is right now, surveys show, it's not just a supposition, we can see in surveys of Jews, certainly of British Jews, and I think of Jews in other areas, other places also, you can tell me about Australia, show very, very clearly that commitment to Israel's welfare is overwhelming among among diaspora Jews, that diaspora Jews overwhelmingly see Israel as an important or very important part of their Jewish identity. They visit Israel, certainly perhaps less so from Australia where it's a little difficult to access, but certainly from the UK, British Jews from across the spectrum visit Israel. They spend time in Israel, they have family in Israel, they have friends in Israel. And we need to communicate to the outside world that may be confused on this point that Israel is very, very central to the identity of most Jews, and certainly those Jews who are committed to their Jewishness and their Jewish identity, and that are most likely to pass that Jewish identity on to their children and grandchildren. those Jews are overwhelmingly attached to Israel in their identity.
Thank you. We have just under 10 minutes left, so I want to open it to the floor. I think we can be fairly informal. If anyone has a question, if they just unmute, I think Ezra might give people the ability to unmute, and then just launch in with a question. And if two people speak at the same time, I'm sure we can be civilized about it and try to somebody can go first. So if anyone does have a question, then just unmute and launch yourself.
It's Mark Inberg here.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. I was thinking about in the beginning when you're speaking of the prohibition of not allowing Hametz into hospitals, and wondering why that's the case. Is that just visitors and staff? Because you'd think that patients might need Hametz in their medications and other dietary requirements. And yeah, it's like I can go into synagogue now on Shabbat with my phone in my pocket. It's turned off, and I'm still allowed my phone in to shul. It seems very strict for Israel that has cafes open on Shabbat, nightclubs open on Shabbat. I'm just trying to work out, is that maybe it's to consider the religious, like the ultra-Orthodox that visit the hospital?
So there's been a bit of a blurring historically between what's kind of legally allowed with respect to chametz during Pesach and what's kind of conventional. So the law actually just says shops are not allowed to display chametz. There's no prohibition even on selling it or producing it, or certainly on consuming it. Obviously, if you go into an Arab town or neighborhood in Israel, you're going to find you can get yourself some pita bread, no problem. But if you go into a supermarket in a predominantly Jewish area or city, you'll find you won't be able to buy chametz. You won't be able to find it on sale. Certain areas of the supermarket will be kind of covered up, and that's how things work. And the culture has been quite strongly to sort of almost stronger than the law, in a sense. The convention has been stronger than the law. And I think that's what you've seen in the case of hospitals. I guess the concern has been to avoid Jewish patients and staff coming into contact with chametz that's been brought into the hospital by a patient or a visitor. And people are not thinking, I don't think, so much about medications. I don't know. I'm not an expert on that particular side of it. Certainly, I think medications will be treated more leniently with respect to the necessity in terms of preserving life and all the rest of it. The people are thinking of is, somebody bringing in foodstuffs to the hospital, and then that might, that a staff member or a patient might come into contact with. So that, I think, was the thinking. And it also applied to military bases. There's another controversy about military bases. Because, of course, many soldiers are not observant and they may wish to be consuming chametz, whether not necessarily sort of a loaf of bread or a pita bread, but maybe, a packet of crisps or a product that isn't explicitly kosher for Pesach. Many secular Israelis are not going, would not want to be restricted in that sense. But the court ruling was that this to actually inspect bags is an infringement of people's liberties, essentially. And so what the hospitals have done now, for example, the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, which of course has many, many religious patients and staff, as well as many Arab patients and staff. So that's where you got to kind of really got the two coming together, people that are not Jewish and so not observing Passover, not observing Pesach in any way, and religious Jews in the same institution. They've said, we're asking people to be considerate. We're not going to search bags because the Supreme Court said we can't. We're just asking people to be considerate, and that's how these things should be done. Personally, I think that's kind of the sensible approach. Ask people to be considerate of others without enforcing something legally. So we're asking our staff not to bring chametz in, but we're not going to be searching.
Yeah, I guess also a hospital like a military base, you're very on the borderline between life and death. So you'd think Hashem would like you to be as spiritual and holy as possible in those places, and he would look more kindly upon you, just to take that extra precaution, I guess. Yeah.
That's a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Are there other questions? Well, maybe I'll ask something very different until give people a minute to think of another question if they have. Just thinking back to Manchester in the 80s and 90s.
Good day.
But really, would you say really the last flowering of mainstream Jewry in Manchester in provincial England, that when we were growing up, there were major communities in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Glasgow, declining, yes, in places like Edinburgh and Leicester, where Professor Liebens is from, who we spoke to a little while ago. What are your reflections on conditions moving on in terms of diaspora Jewry and the shrinking of places like Manchester, which was still so vibrant when we were coming of age?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's very much reflected in my own personal experience. I moved to London. Both my brothers and my sister moved to London, and now in the last year, my parents also made the decision to move to London because that's where my brothers and my sister are, and UK-based grandchildren are also. So yeah, and I, obviously it's just reflected the experience of many of my friends and contemporaries, and probably yours as well, Ben. But we don't see a disappearance of the community in Manchester, but we do see a change in its demographic. I mean, there is still a sustainable community. My parents went to a pretty vibrant shul in Whitefield where they lived before they went to London. But there is a big demographic shift also, and that's reflected, caused in part by the dramatic demographic growth of the ultra-Orthodox sector in all of Jewish communities, I think, but including in the UK. So I grew up in Broughton Park, which is the kind of heartland of the ultra-Orthodox community in Manchester. And Broughton Park is expanding into other areas of Salford around the other neighboring areas around it because of the dramatic demographic growth of the ultra-Orthodox sector. So I think what's really interesting going forward, there is a concentration of communities, particularly in London. But there's also a very remarkable shift in terms of the ultra-Orthodox community. I don't know if that's the case also in Australia, but some projections, demographic projections, project that by the end of the century, or in the second half of the century, the ultra-Orthodox community could be 50% of British Jewry or more. And that will, of course, have very significant effects for the character of the Jewish community in the UK. And of course, we see similar demographic trends, or let's say comparable demographic trends here in Israel, where the ultra-Orthodox community, on average 6 children per woman. That kind of birth rate matched only by the Bedouin community in southern Israel. And so that will also change the character in terms of that balance that I spoke about, the Jewishness versus the liberal democratic character of the state. There is a demographic trend in play there also, with the growing demographic of the ultra-Orthodox sector, albeit there are other demographics that are growing fast as parts of the Arab sector, although perhaps less so. So yeah, that's something I think we'll have to contend with going forward, and consider how that is going to change the character of both of Israeli Jewishness and diaspora Jewishness.
Well, you and I are each part of the diaspora. I'm part of the Jewish diaspora from the land of Israel, and we're both part of the Mancudian diaspora, which has its own character. I want to thank you very much. Wish you Chag Kasher Sameach for the forthcoming Chag of Pesach, and I'm sure looking forward to reading and hearing lots from you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. And I visited Sydney once many years ago, very fond memories of it, and hope to get back again sometime in the future.
We look forward. Good night,
Take care.
everybody, and thanks for joining, and God bless.